Today we're going to do something a little different. We are going to break down a sermon that weaves together history and ancient prayer and that feeling we all know of just being completely and utterly exhausted. So let's dive in and see how it all connects. So the whole thing kicks off with a really powerful physical metaphor. Canterbury Cathedral in England. Now, this is not just any old church. We're talking about a place that's been burned down, ransacked, and damaged for the better part of 1,000 years. It's a story of constant ruin and constant repair.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole explainer, right? How on earth does the story of a stone building connect to our own feelings, of being broken down and needing to be put back together again? Well, that's what we're here to figure out.
It all comes down to one single, powerful word that connects the building to the spirit: restore. This sermon uses the very real physical restoration of Canterbury Cathedral as a jumping-off point to talk about a much deeper, more personal kind of restoration.
Just look at this timeline. What's wild is how persistent the damage was. The sermon points out these massive fires back in the 11th and 12th centuries, then huge damage during the English Civil War. And get this. A statue of Christ on the main gate was torn down and wasn't put back, wasn't restored until 1990. This isn't just some dusty old story. It's a living cycle of destruction and rebuilding happening in recent memory.
So how do you get from a physical building to a spiritual plea? Well, the sermon argues that this deep, deep need for restoration isn't new, not at all. In fact, you could almost call it the source code of one of the most ancient prayers in the book of Psalms. And here it is. This one line is repeated 3 times in Psalm 80. The sermon makes it clear this isn't just poetry. This is a desperate, gut-wrenching cry for help, a plea to be made whole again. This is the heartbeat of the entire message.
Now here's a crucial point. This wasn't some abstract prayer. The sermon frames it as a direct response to these huge, nation-shattering crises. We're talking about real existential threats: the Philistines, the Assyrian invasion, being exiled to Babylon. This prayer was born from moments when people felt like they were about to be completely wiped off the map.
Okay, and this is where the sermon makes its big move. It takes us from that ancient national trauma and brings it right into our own modern personal lives. How does a prayer from thousands of years ago mean anything to us today?
This sermon just comes right out and asks this question. And it's so powerful because for most of us, the answer is a huge yes. It takes this grand historical theme and brings it right down to that feeling of just being completely worn out by life. And then the message uses this really beautiful, relatable language. It suggests that, while we try to present ourselves as solid and all put together, we all know how vulnerable we are to just crumbling under the pressure. And the analogy just keeps going. We might see ourselves as sterling, right? Shiny and strong. But life has a way of making us feel, all rusted out. It's that gap between how we look on the outside and how we feel on the inside that the sermon really hones in on. So, here's the argument in a nutshell. When we're caught in what the sermon calls the crushing realities of life, those ancient words suddenly stop being historical artifacts. They become our own personal prayers for restoration. So, if that's the problem, this deep human need for restoration, then what's the answer? Well, the sermon pivots and says you can find it right in the Christmas story, and specifically in one very important name: Emmanuel. So what does Emmanuel actually mean? Well, it comes from a prophecy in the book of Isaiah, and it literally translates to God with us. The sermon argues that this very idea is the direct answer to that ancient cry to be restored. Now, here's a really key theological point in the sermon's logic. It argues that Isaiah's prophecy had an immediate meaning for the people back in his day, but that its ultimate fulfillment, its biggest, most complete meaning, is found centuries later in the birth of Jesus. What's so interesting is that the Christmas story itself isn't told in just one way, and the sermon really highlights this. You've got Matthew's version focusing on Joseph and the Magi. Then there's Luke, who gives us that iconic manger scene with shepherds and angels. And John goes totally cosmic, talking about the Word, light, and life. The sermon really zeroes in on Matthew's account for a specific reason. The name the angel tells Joseph to use is Jesus. And what does that name mean? God heals. I mean, you can't get more direct than that. It ties the very identity of this person back to that central theme of healing and restoration. Okay, so how does all this history and theology actually work in our lives?
Well, the final part of the sermon brings it all into the present tense, arguing that restoration isn't some one-and-done event from the past. It's an ongoing process. So how does it happen now? According to the message, it happens through engaging with sacred stories. It happens through music and prayer. And it happens through community, through fellowship with other people. It's about what you do, not just what you believe.
And that is the ultimate takeaway. The sermon's big conclusion is that the promise of Emmanuel, of God with us, isn't just a historical fact to remember. It's a present tense reality to be experienced right here, right now. And the sermon ends with this incredibly powerful, direct statement. It shifts from explaining an idea to declaring it as a reality for the listener. It's not "you will be restored," it's "you are being restored."
So, the sermon offers this one powerful path to feeling whole again, connecting history, prayer, and personal experience. And that leaves us with a final question to think about for ourselves. What does restoration mean in your own story?